Hello, everyone. I'm Richard Fink, a lawyer who specializes in workers' compensation. Today is the Injured Workers Side podcast with Richard and Paul. Paul?
Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Taylor. I'm a paralegal licensed by the Law Society of Ontario with a specialization in workers' compensation and human rights law. If you want to reach out to either one of us or even be part of our podcast, like we've had many guests before, you can contact us through the links below. This week's topic is calculating earnings basis, and this specifically means in relation to when a worker gets injured, how the board calculates your benefits from your gross earnings, I guess, right, Richard? Because employers report gross earnings, and the WSIB, the Workplace Safety Insurance Act or the Workers' Compensation Act, says you're to get either 90% or 85% if you're unlucky to get injured after 98 of your net earnings. So the board has to do that calculation, plus also based on what your actual earnings were and that kind of thing. So that's what we're going to talk about. It seems a little bit confusing, but hopefully people understand.
So you'd think that calculating earnings would be fairly simple and not have a great deal of conflict and aggravation, given that the whole purpose of workers' compensation is to try and make things as simple and easy and fair as possible for people who get injured, given that they can't sue. But like everything else within the WSIB network, earnings basis can be controversial and complicated. And the one case I wanted to start with was my client who worked for a company. I won't name the company. And the WSIAT decision, for those of you who'd like to look at it, is 39523. And briefly, what happened was the worker is working under a union contract, and about 10 days before he's injured, he gets promoted to become a full-time worker in the sense that he now has tenure security with the employer, and they raise his wage. And they raise it a few dollars an hour, which makes a big difference in terms of your income. And the WSIB says, you're not the same worker throughout the previous year as you are now. So what we're going to do is we're going to recalculate your earnings basis in terms of what we pay you on the 13th week, because it's the 13th week that the board has to look at your earnings to see whether they're properly calculated. And they said, what we're going to do is we're going to use your earnings you were making before you were promoted and received an increase in your wage. And it's grossly unfair because had he not been injured, he would have continued receiving the new wage plus even future increases in the future. Now, they're never taken into account, but they weren't even going to use the wage that he would have been making at the time of the accident going forward. So this cost them, I think it might have been like $150 a week. And on top of that, there was question, he didn't work the same number of hours every week. He was in one of those continental shifts that varied from time to time. So they had to try and calculate how many hours on average are you working. And he got a premium when he was working extra hours. So it became a large, complicated case. And the case took 3 years to resolve from the time they cut him down to the time we got to the appeals tribunal, which is also amazingly appalling that someone has to wait 3 years to get the money they're supposed to be getting while they're off work. So eventually we were successful. The decision was that they would use the earnings he was making when he was injured, and they would, in terms of the number of hours per week, they would go back the previous 4 weeks from the accident, see what the average hours are, which was fair. So that was that case. And I'd be interested to hear what Paul has to say on this.
It concerns me because people and many injured worker advocates in my community yell at me when I even bring up insurance. But it's not that I say I'm not like the WSIB where they claim it's insurance. It isn't. I mean, I get angry when they say it is. They even have three insurance people, as they say, on their board of directors. It concerns me because they miss the meaning of workers' compensation. Like you said earlier, right to workers. You don't have a right to insurance or anything. You pay premiums and you're getting some coverage or as they say in the books, the legal books, confidence in knowing that if you're unable to work or whatever, you have some coverage. Workers' compensation removes that, all that litigation and everything, but in return, you're supposedly to have a right to coverage and speedy coverage and everything else. This is where I get upset with the courts because they're still maintaining this claim when it's dead for many years. But one of the biggest controversies is the way in Ontario the board calculates your income. The first thing I notice in my own case and others is compared to when I've dealt with clients in Manitoba and Alberta, is I can't remember which one it is. I think it's Manitoba. But when the worker's injured, they write to the worker right away and they say, your employer reported to us your gross earnings are this. They also said that you have 16 children. I'm kidding. One or two children, or no children, or you're single. Based on Revenue Canada's tax guidelines, your taxes would be this, your Canada pension plan is this, your EI is this, therefore your net income is this. We provide 90% of your net, therefore your benefits are this. So you know exactly where you stand. They are transparent, right? Ontario, you don't know. They don't tell you anything. I have no doubt, Richard, that injured worker didn't know how they base the averages or anything. They never gave them the calculations. They weren't. I used to fight for decades to try and get the simple calculations from the board. They would just say, see this chart. No, I want you to tell me, like I'm a simpleton because I am. I'm not an accountant. I'm not a CPA or anything. I want you to tell me that simple chart like they do in Manitoba or Alberta or Saskatchewan. Why can't you do that? Why is it that that's so difficult? The other problem is many times injured workers, employers will mistakenly, it's a twofold hit, and this is where injured workers and reps have to be very careful, I've noticed. Is my mom, when I was younger, when my mom was alive, she used to always tell me this little trick she did to save money was she would tell the employer she was single. Then at the end of the tax year, she would report to Revenue Canada truthfully that she had two or three kids or whatever, and she get this nice tax refund. I mean, it wasn't really a tax refund, it was a silly way of saving money, in my opinion. But sorry, mom. But now when you think about it, it's a bad thing because then the HR person at your employer then reports to the board while that person is single, but they're not. And you might say, well, how does this impact their benefits? Because now your net earnings are much higher because you have more tax write-offs. And a lot of workers, this confuses them. Then there's one that I have a great controversy for, Richard, is if you have a permanent disability in Canada, Revenue Canada will give you what's called as a disability tax credit. You have to apply for it, provide medical documentation and everything, but you get a $10,000 a year tax credit. The WSIB, as far as I know, does not recognize this at all. That's a huge difference in your benefit calculation from gross to net. So that's one huge issue that I think reps and injured workers need to take a closer look at is their benefits, is saying, how did you calculate my benefits? Like when I have an injured worker come to me, the first thing I look at when I get their claim file, I zero in on the forms. I want to see the employer's report, workers report, doctor's report. And the one I go right at is the employer's report, is I look at their earnings basis and I ask them, I say, are you single? Do you have like five kids or whatever? And then I look at the employer's report and see that they made that declaration. And do you know what, Richard, what's funny? Most employers actually don't fill out the income information on the employer's report. And the board never does anything about it. Workers too, they should be like, this is a joint thing that workers need to stay on top of this and saying, hey, to the board right at the beginning. because this is where it creates a nightmare 5 or 10 or 20 years later when you're trying to fight for it, you know? But I did want to bring up one case I had a few years ago, and it was quite strange case. The worker, he was injured. The board gave him a permanent partial LOE benefit, whatever you want to call it. Like, in other words, he's getting this amount till age 65. And in Ontario, when you've been injured after 1998, I believe it is, they have what they call as a lock-in period for loss of earnings benefits. And they have that period of time, I think it's 72 months. And 70 at the 72nd month, they usually do a review and say, what's your income, that kind of thing, and then they lock in your benefits. And that's when they do, like you said, the average earnings basis. And in this worker's case, he actually, while he was working, he actually got a pay raise, but it was actually after the 72-month lock-in. And his case manager actually lied to him and said, no, 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 it's to the end of the month. His work injury was, say, the 10th of the month, and his pay raise occurred on, say, the 20th. But the case manager said, no, no, it's to the end of the month. What I was surprised to learn when I researched it was this was a very common problem at the WSIB, and I'm surprised to say the Fair Practice Commission actually did raise a concern with the WSIB, and the WSIB said, yes, 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 we'll deal with that because that is completely wrong. Well, actually, they didn't. It's like your famous case, Castrillo, with the pre-existing condition things. I remember once you told me, correct me if I'm wrong, you said, the board promised they wouldn't do that anymore. Well, I'm talking to a lot of injured workers, and I'm getting the feeling they're back doing at it again. And I think this is a problem from earnings basis to the pre-existing to the way they calculate benefits. Everything is that it seems like the board is a good boy for a little while, and then they go right back to their old ways, as it were.
Let me give the audience a look that the tribunal, which is the final level of decision making, unfortunately, it can take 3 years to get there, but the tribunal in decision 1666, that's three sixes, 1666, 23R, has ruled that fairness is important. So let me give a couple COVID cases. We had a case where the worker was a construction worker and he would take off during the winter and go back to Brazil. So he'd leave around November when the winter sets in, as people know today, and he'd come back in April to start work again. So he'd be off 4 or 5 months. And his problem was when he went to come back in April of 2020, you can't get on a plane. You couldn't land at the airport because of the COVID outbreak. So when he got injured later on that summer, the WSIB looked at his earnings and they said, well, if we look at it, you didn't get back to Toronto until like June or July. So you only work 3, 4 months of the year, and that's how we're going to calculate your earnings. And our position was don't use the year with the COVID because that's the year everything is disrupted in terms of earnings. And I can tell you that we lost the case. We even did a reconsideration, did not go to court, but we did a reconsideration and lost it. However, another rep won the case, and I'll give the number 46924. And they said, don't use the COVID year as the year for earnings calculation because it's just not a fair year.
But
And in that
Richard,
case, the worker was missing a lot of time from work because of COVID, whereas the previous year it was 40 hours times 50, and that was the expectation in the year following the COVID. So there is supposed to be fairness at the tribunal, and tribunal's usually fair, but what you see is not often what you get.
Richard, when you're talking about, like, say, for example, well, the policy says we go back 6 months or a year or 3 years or whatever, and then average earnings. And then, like you just said, this unprecedented historical event occurred. And you're saying, well, just cut that out and then do that. Wouldn't that be like in legal circles when they talk about statutory interpretation, they talk about the intent of the legislation, which basically the Workplace Safety Insurance Act, actually, I could be wrong when I say this because it has veered so far away from the original workers' compensation law from 1915. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, the the purpose of the workers' compensation legislation is to provide for the worker, to care for them. That's why it has what we call the benefit of the doubt, meaning if the evidence is equal for and against, it goes to the worker, which is unheard of in any civil litigation. It's always you have to prove um, balance of probabilities. And it frustrates me because I always hear decision makers at the board and tribunal will say uh, balance of probabilities. When I'm like, no, actually, it's benefit of the doubt. But my point to that is wouldn't that in a decision maker doing that, wouldn't they be following the intent of the legislation? And I believe I read that somewhere in a Supreme Court decision is that you don't necessarily blindly follow the law. You have to look at the intent of the legislation as well.
Well, let me give another case. The worker was getting room and board as part of his employment. So picture living in Timmins and you've got to go to some mine at a remote site and you live there for weeks at a time while you're working. And essentially, you've got free room and board, which includes meals. And the WSIB did not use the room and board as part of his income. So if you're living in Toronto and you're paying $2,000 a month, or let's say you're living in Windsor and they send you to Toronto to go do some work and they give you free room and board in Toronto, that's worth about $4,000 a week between the food and the rent. And it should be included in your income because you're getting something that's like a wage and the board wouldn't include it. So if they're talking about fairness, how can it be fair that before the accident you got room and board and after the accident you don't? And the decision from the tribunal on this, and again, it had to go 3 years to get to the tribunal, was 92324 for those who want to look at it. I think the problem is that fairness is what's in the statute, and it talks about fairness in the board's policies. So there's three policies on this. They're 180202, 180203, 180204. It mentions the word fairness all the time, but the WSIB is looking at it in terms of what makes the most economic sense, not just fairness. So there's two different themes that one sees both and looking at it and in what the you see at appeals tribunal decisions.
See, you raise a very interesting point because I've represented like this one case, it was actually a small claims court, but he was a boilermaker, a guy that worked on piping or whatever, I don't know. And he had often go to Sarnia and Windsor and that and do jobs. And he said his employer, they wouldn't provide him room and board. They paid him. So it was a form of income that while he was working, this covered his expenses. So they paid his expenses for that. And as far as I'm concerned, that is a form of income. Just because the employer and it opens up, when you think about it, this opens up a can of worms. Because if you can establish then that the average worker or the average room and board or whatever you want to call it, that expense, right? But for that accident, that worker didn't have to pay rent, which would be, say, $500 a month or whatever, right? That it's not so much of an expense or a savings, but as an income, right? And then you would open it up because I'll give you a good example right off the top of my head. Truck drivers, long haul truck drivers, their room is literally right behind them, right? And they don't pay for the room. Well, they better not. I wouldn't be surprised if that's a new initiative to save money. But they don't pay for that room. So that's a huge savings to them. But it's not a savings, it's an income. You know what I mean? Like if you didn't do that and you had to pay, it's the same with traveling salesmen. Thinking about it logically, you're not having to pay rent. I used to know many truck drivers where they literally didn't have an apartment or a house. They would live, so to speak, they would lay their hat at their sisters or mothers, right? I did for many years, right? And they didn't need to have an apartment. But then you get injured and it's like you have to stay here in Toronto or Ottawa or wherever you live now. And now you have to pay that rent, which, but for your accident, you never had to. So
So
it would raise,
yeah. Talking of independent operators,
oh
when
God,
they
don't go
file
down
their
that road.
taxes, I've seen them have an expense for their wife to do bookkeeping. I've seen them take off their income use of a car when they're mostly using it for personal things.
That's called, Richard, they call that today is what's called as driver Inc., where
Yes.
transport companies started it and said to drivers, you have to register a business and you're an independent contractor, which is BS because, and the Supreme Court has often ruled on this, there was many cases that if you don't control your schedule or anything, and they'll go, yes, you do. No, you don't. You don't have an independent contractor to me is when I pick up the phone and I call the plumber and he comes and he works on my place and I don't never see him again. A dependent contractor is somebody that is dependent on me. And under the previous Employment Standards Act, the dependent contractor under the law is an employee. The only difference is you don't take taxes off. And I believe, and I could be wrong about this because I'm not up on my employment law. I think Doug Ford changed the law to accommodate Uber and all them. But it's a very messy subject but it does impact WSIB because many workers were so-called dependent or independent contractors. In fact, I was, but I made sure when I went to work because the work I did was very dangerous. I said, "You pay WSIB?" Yeah. I said, "Okay, good." And that's the thing is now WSIB is changing what they say is an independent, a real, you know what I mean, independent contractor. And it's not what the courts and the law says. They have their own definition. So you have what the courts say, what the law says, and then you have what WSI. It's a real mess. But it'll be interesting to see what happens, what Mark Carney says, because he recently said they're going to be dealing with it. Because it's partly to do, and I'm not getting into I'm just talking. I believe the reason why it's such a controversial issue is because I think what's happening is people are coming to Canada illegally, registering a business, getting a truck driver's license, and then driving a truck and working here illegally. Now, I don't know if that's the truth or that's all the reality of it, but it becomes a great concern for the industry, and for everything else, as well as for work injuries and that. So,
Let me
it'll be
just
interesting to see what he says and does.
let me just end with two cases. The first one is somebody who called me for an inquiry as to whether we could help him when I spoke to him on Saturday. And that was he's getting paid $20 an hour in cash. And when the employer tells the board how much he's making, it's minimum wage at $17 an hour. And the question is, how can you prove that the employer's lying when it's all in cash? And one of the ways, of course, is if you were depositing all the money into the bank. But that becomes a very difficult equation because you might be using some of the cash to actually buy stuff. So that case, I said to him, you're going to need some evidence from, say, the other workers saying that everyone in your situation who gets hired is getting $20, not 17. The second one, which happened to us about 5, 6 years ago, but took about 2 years to resolve, was the worker is in school studying to be a nurse. And part-time, he's doing work in construction to help pay for the nursing school. And he gets injured, badly injured in the legs, and he'll never be a nurse because nurses need to be able to walk around. And he has a limitation on walking. So the argument is that if you lose the job you're being trained for when you're injured, you're supposed to be paid as to what you would make if you did get retrained and did get the new job. And our argument was you should pay him based on a nurse's wages, not a part-time construction worker's wages. And eventually the board relented, but it was 2 years fighting. And it's an obvious situation where the injury caused much greater financial harm than just lost wage at the time.
It's interesting you mentioned that case. I actually have currently a client in the same position. They were a PSW, and I will honestly say I can see why there's a shortage of PSWs. They're probably one of the highest injury rate jobs because, let's be honest, people aren't, as you would say, like you, underweight. They're more worse than me in many cases, really heavily overweight. And you don't think about it when they're 300 pounds. That's a lot of weight that you have to maneuver. And this causes a lot of physical permanent injuries, and that's one of the arguments was is they were training to become a nurse practitioner. And in the case manager's decisions, they've denied all that. It's going to the board of appeals and probably to tribunal. But they flat out said, no, 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 no. But I think so they were in your case with your client, they were training part-time.
They were in the school, but they hadn't got to nursing school. You have to get a science degree before you hit nursing school.
Yeah, I understand. My
So
daughter's actually doing that. Yeah.
they were on their way. But
Hmm.
um, we'll leave it there. As I said earlier, as in most things with WSIB, when things should be clear and easy, they tend to be complicated and difficult. So thank you again, Paul. Thanks everyone for watching, and
Thanks,
hope to
everyone.
see you in a week or two. Take care.